This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home. Welcome to the 8th and penultimate Tory Leadership Election podcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in discussion with Mark Wallace, executive editor of Conservative Home. Mark, we're gradually moving away as election day, results day approaches from Hunt's week and Johnson's week, because they're fading out. I mean, my sense this week is that the big event has been the London debate with 4,000 people. And other than that, it's been pretty quiet. Boris Johnson's done some stuff today, I should say yesterday, we're recording this on the Friday, on social care. But kind of basically, we're moving into a period where everyone is assuming Boris Johnson has won, either very comfortably or fairly comfortably, and we will get the result on Tuesday. What do you make of the week?
Well, that hustings, as you say, in London was the dominant event, undoubtedly. And I suspect it'll quite please the Conservative Party, as well as both candidates, really, that was the main event. It struck me, looking at it, it was so unusual to actually see any event where you get so many Conservative Party members together without the intention of them just being kind of lectured and told how grateful they ought to be for being Conservative Party members. The party conference doesn't provide the kind of event that was. And actually, it was the right decision, I think, despite the scepticism that I confess I had, among others, about having that hustings so late as to whether anybody would really pay much attention to it, given it was right before the deadline to send your vote in. Deciding to make it quite a big event, apparently to put some decent amount of cash into it, to make it quite sizable, try and get a bit of a buzz around it, I think did work. And they'll be griping, it's London, London always gets the best stuff. And yet, I think it was a pretty positive thing all around.
We'll come in a moment to the whole question of the postal ballot and whether enough people have received their papers and other issues like people getting 2 sets of papers. So you've got some people who are complaining because they've had 2 sets, other people who are complaining because they've had none at all. But at the cost of taking a complacent view of the world, and remember, I mean, we're a site that's called on 2 of the last 3 party chairmen to resign. I have to say, I think CCHQ's done a decent job of the hustings. I wasn't at London, I was at the Maidstone one. The members are as the members are, but the quality of the questions was high. They were short, sharp and succinct. I noticed earlier during the campaign, George Parker of the Financial Times, it's not obviously a paper with a warm view of Conservative Party members, saying how impressed he was at the hustings he went to. And I think that the contest has displayed there are more members. They are pretty sober, serious citizens. They're not the purple momentum of left-wing legend. And slowly over the last year or so, we've moved from a situation in which it was speculated there were below 100,000 members to a situation where the membership looks as though it's over 150,000 and pretty healthy.
Yes, and we're told that somewhere around 30,000 Conservative Party members at least registered an interest to attend one of these hustings. Certainly thousands upon thousands actually did so. That's quite good penetration for among a party's membership of this kind of size. It seems to have been quite an energised event, and actually I suspect, intentionally or otherwise, it'll sow the seed in more than a few Tory members' minds that, hang on a second, why don't we get the chance to speak to really senior politicians more often? Why don't we get the chance to ask questions of people who are party leader, never mind wannabe party leaders? Why will really party conference in its quite old, quite dull, very managed format, in which members often say they feel like they're basically paying through the nose to be meat in the room. I wonder if that will pale by comparison. There'll be people at party conference in the autumn who look back on the hustings and think, I wish it was a bit more like that.
On the other side of the ledger, what do you think about the number of complaints from people who say they've not received a vote at all?
It's very, very hard to put a specific number on the scale of this problem. You're always going to have an issue like this in any kind of ballot. The Conservative Party engaged electoral reform services who do ballots for trade union strike ballots and all sorts of different shareholder ballots, all sorts of different things to do this. They are experienced in it. The party's data isn't perfect, but it's improved by centralisation of membership to where it was, say, when David Cameron beat David Davis, when even the Conservative Party didn't really know how many members it actually had. But there clearly have been some problems. Some people have been complaining about not getting a ballot when actually they're not really not technically members anymore. Some people who really are definitely members have not received a ballot. They've been quite dissatisfied about that. From my point of view, somebody who's done quite a lot of reporting and I was quite sceptical and cynical about the performance of the Tory party's machine operations, this has not been as bad as I feared it might turn out to be. We may yet find out more about the scale of the problem, but if there are some issues, they haven't been on the kind of really sizable systemic scale that I think some people were really hoping they would be.
And let's look ahead now to the coming week. First of all, tomorrow, I say today, Saturday, for all I know, there may be a final YouGov poll in the market showing us what Boris Johnson's level of support is. It's just worth toddling through the figures again. Our first survey found he was on 67%. The second one found he was on about 72%. We've another one in the field that will come out tomorrow. We've not yet got up to the YouGov standard, who found 74% of party members were going to vote for Boris Johnson. I think it's fair to say that the general assumption is that he's won. I think it's worth saying that none of these polls or surveys are an immaculate measure. That always applies, but it's particularly so in this case. If you're doing a poll before a general election, most people vote on one day. About 25% of people have applied for postal votes, but the vast majority vote on a day. With any survey that's taken place, you are basically trying to capture a moving picture. So our most recent one for Sunday, the one people will see tomorrow, does carry in it a certain number of people who are telling us how they voted up to 2 weeks ago. And we know that people's memories of what they did, rather than their declaration of what they're going to do tomorrow, that can be a bit fallible.
Yes, it's also the case, of course, that because this has effectively been a weeks-long polling day, as you say, the different campaigns have peaked and troughed at different times. There's a certain amount of expectation or hope, I think, in some, not necessarily pro-Hunt quarters, but Boris skeptic, Johnson skeptic quarters, yes, that maybe Hunt will overperform expectations. Might be a much closer race.
Sure.
But the question is really a sense check of when did Jeremy Hunt's campaign peak and when did Boris Johnson's campaign hit its nadir? Well, I think both of those things happened before ballot papers went out. The perfect time to target for the peak of your campaign is the day when ballot papers land. The ballot papers seem to have landed slightly earlier than anybody, including us, and including various people at CCHQ, necessarily expected them to. But neither campaign really managed to hammer on that big day. As it was, really the Jeremy Hunt campaign was the one that had a hill to climb. It was the one that had a result to change. And while it did some good running early on, when it got some opportunities and some windows of opportunity, I don't detect it having happened at that crucial time. Also, in a sense check, where are the voters who either our survey or YouGov's opinion polling, where are the voters who either of us are inherently unable to find, who are more likely to be pro-Hunt than pro-Johnson? I think that's the key distinction, is if there are people who haven't cropped up on our system, are perhaps relatively newer to the party, are harder for YouGov to contact, all of those indicators we've talked about in previous episodes make them, I would suggest, more likely to be more Brexity even than the average Conservative member. That doesn't suggest yet that there's any real logical basis to assume that there's a secret reservoir of Hunt voters.
So actually, the most probable outcome is that the election will be roughly in the general area that the surveys and YouGov have said. But we will see. Tuesday it is. So it's worth looking ahead now to the Johnson inheritance. I have to say, I think he faces the bleakest prospects of any incoming Prime Minister I can remember. After the Brecon by-election, he's likely only to have a working majority of 3. That's with the aid of the DUP. On the one hand, he's going to have Philip Hammond, Rory Stewart, David Lidington, David Gauke, Greg Clark, all on the backbenches, possibly with other members of the cabinet, all campaigning against leaving on October the 31st. And, we've seen that they won a big victory this week over prorogation. But on the other hand, he's got the Spartans waiting, on the other hand, for him to resign in any way from the stance that he's taken that we must leave on October the 31st. Finally, that leads one to the thought that, is there a deep strategic purpose, a kind of plan there, to get from A to B, to get from where we are now to Brexit on October 31st, despite a Commons that's clearly unwilling to go on that date? And I think it looks very doubtful and very difficult, and that there's probably, unless no deal somehow slips through the cracks, there's probably a general election coming down the road.
This is the real reason why the odds of an election have risen. It's not particularly that prorogation in itself is so valuable to a new government, that without it they must have an election. It's the fact that, yet again, we've seen another vote in which the Conservative parties, or the Conservative government's majority, has been further eroded. More people rebelling, Margot James resigning from the government to join the backbench rebellion, more new ministers choosing to abstain or stay away at least and ignore a 3-line whip, and the further erosion of collective responsibility directly arising from failure of Theresa May to do anything, or inability to do anything, earlier in the year when ministers did exactly this. They thumbed their noses at the idea of collective responsibility, ignored a 3-line whip, stayed away, and nothing happened. The inevitable outcome of that, from any Conservative viewpoint, if you did it in business or law or anything else, is if there's no consequences, then you'll do it again.
And let's think on. I mean, there is a school of thought that says that that group of people will pop out of the box at the end of next week, that they'll say they're not going to support Boris Johnson, that Theresa May has to go and see the Queen, that Theresa May can't recommend that Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister because he's not got the support, and we head off into the unknown. For what it's worth, I think that's very unlikely, but the real test surely is going to come in early September, when that's the big chance that Jeremy Corbyn has to call a no confidence vote, and or Dominic Grieve and company have to try to head off a no-deal Brexit on October the 31st if there isn't an agreement. And that seems to me what we're heading towards now, rather than Boris Johnson not becoming Prime Minister next week or a no confidence vote next week. I mean, that said, we've got to think about how Philip Hammond and co react to the Boris Johnson moment on Tuesday. And I have to say, Mark, I think some of these characters, they're clearly going to resign in advance. I mean, we need to think aloud about how they're going to go about spoiling Boris Johnson's party. I mean, are they going to go just before he's made leader, or are they going to go immediately afterwards and take the shine off any headlines he's going to get?
If I was them, I'd go immediately afterwards, possibly
Yes.
even during his acceptance speech. Actually, you get the point where people's phones start buzzing saying that one minister or another has walked out of their department, and look, conveniently, there's a television camera right there, a Westminster TV camera that hasn't happened to go to Boris Johnson's speech, has actually, just by coincidence, happened to pick up one cabinet minister or 2 or 3 or 4 walking out. The fact is that if they know, whether by personal disagreement with Boris Johnson or the impact and consequences of their failure to vote this week, or all sorts of other things, if they know, they believe that they're about to lose their job anyway, then why wouldn't they go on their own terms?
Indeed, and what you could see if they really wanted to play havoc with the news, is for one to resign literally every couple of hours and just keep the story rolling on. I mean, I'm just wondering, this is sort of purely thinking aloud, can Boris Johnson preempt this in some way by announcing who his main ministers will be before he's actually returned as leader? I mean, could he cut the ground from under their feet in that way, perhaps?
It starts to get down to extremely tight timings. It's got to be tempting if you're wargaming this inside Johnson Towers and you're trying to work out exactly how you might be able to do it. Well, they might try and preempt me sacking them by resigning as soon as I've finished my speech. Well, I'll say something in my speech. Well, in that case, they might resign during my speech. I don't think you can be so presumptuous as to actually appoint your cabinet before the result has been announced. Even Boris Johnson, I think, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think would find that perhaps a little OTT. It's not impossible to imagine him bringing some people up on stage.
He could brief it out on Sunday. I mean, the telephone call to Tim Shipman from someone or other, and the Sunday Times say could run definitively, this will be his top team, and that makes it clear that some of these characters are going to be on the way out in any event.
Yes, and I think there's got to be an opportunity. If I was writing his speech, if I was designing how he might accept that result, assuming that's what happens, there's a clear opportunity to start showing some unity from the stage at that event. Again, this is going to be the last big event of the leadership race before a new prime ministerial term begins. And there's going to be an opportunity to actually say, here are some of the people who stood against me, for example, in this race. Here are the Matt Hancocks, the Sajid Javids. Bring them up on stage, give them a round of applause. Oh, look, here's Amber Rudd coming up as well. The fact is that we've had this great division in our party over the last year since Chequers. We've had this great battle for the leadership, and from here on in, we're pulling the party together to deliver a national mission. I think that's got to be the kind of thing you put across.
Of course, the day after that, you've got Theresa May's final PMQs, and I'm asking myself if there isn't a confidence vote in Boris Johnson, quite when he'll go to the House and what he'll say. I think it'd be very odd if he didn't go before the recess kicks in at the end of the week, but we will see. We think let's sort of move on to the question of his team. Now, obviously, we've discussed before in this podcast the way he likes to work. And the way he likes to work is to have lots of these interest groups and individuals around him who are not necessarily in the same place. And he picks up their advice like a monarch dealing with courtiers. Now, again, it's probably fairly fruitless to get into the business of who he might and might not appoint in Downing Street as staff. But I will just make the point that the 3 appointments we know about are all people from his London days. So Eddie Lister, former leader of Wandsworth Council, formerly basically his chief of staff in City Hall, he's coming in as chief of staff. We do know that Munira Mirza, who was the culture czar under Boris Johnson at City Hall, she's coming in to head the policy unit. And we also know, although the details here are a bit more vague, that Daniel Moylan will be coming in as an advisor on Brexit. And he, again, was a KNC councillor, for quite a senior one when Boris Johnson was mayor. So the picture I'm picking up is that the people he seems to want around him at the core, they'll see, not his political rivals. They're not people from his Foreign Office days. They're not, as far as we can see, members of the Vote Leave team. He's falling back on his original comfort blanket, on the role that he always talks about in this contest when he's referring back to things he's done, namely London.
It's the psychology of a leader and how it's illustrated by who they choose to have around them and what the common ties that bind are there. So it's really interesting if you think back to, say, David Cameron, who was somebody where the chumocracy really went back to school. Late days of school and early days of university seemed to be the dominant theme for who you really, really, really trusted in the very, very close circle around David Cameron. Gordon Brown had that kind of comrade card index. kind of group of apparatchiks who, very unlike Gordon Brown, liked drinking a lot and football and loud karaoke, and he would occasionally kind of be uncomfortably laddie with them, or they would be laddie in his presence. The fascinating way in which people try and build a team. Theresa May, of course, while she's been a Home Office Prime Minister, and she brought some but not all of her advisors with her into Downing Street, never really had a club. You always struggle a little bit to find that tribe. That's one thing that made her quite a successful Home Secretary, because she didn't really feel beholden to people beyond the Prime Minister. But it really proved a problem for her in Downing Street. She didn't actually have a very deep or broad group of people around her to be kind of Team May. And so I think it's quite encouraging in some ways to see Boris Johnson's time as a kind of chairman figure, as they talk about it in London, reflected there. But there will be questions in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, not least, about where exactly does Westminster get a look in on all this. There'll be some people who are thinking back to those Cameron years when Boris Johnson was the prince across the water in City Hall and was basically felt not to have much of a support base in Westminster. He's obviously put a lot of work in, as we saw in the parliamentary stage of this leadership race, to try and overcome that, overcome some of the problems it gave him in 2016. But there'll be a huge number of people in the parliamentary party and around it looking for their own role. Where do they fit in this? It can't just be a London operation.
Yes, and I think that applies when it comes to staffing, as well as to the political appointments in the government at cabinet level and ministerial level that we'll come to in a minute. It's very significant to me that you raised Theresa May, who started off with this very tight structure with Nick, Timothy and Fiona Hill running everything. What seems to be pretty clear is that there isn't going to be that sort of figure. I don't think you're going to see Dominic Cummings brought in, which would require, were he to come, everything falling under the command and control of Dominic Cummings. This leads to another very intriguing question. The other person who's famous for, in quotes, running, close quotes, Boris Johnson, is Linton Crosby. I think there's a bit of a question about what Linton Crosby's role will be, because he was pretty active in being around at the earlier stages of the contest, but he's not been in charge of the membership stage of the leadership contest. That person has been Mark Fulbrook, who works with him at Crosby Textor, and by all accounts, Linton Crosby isn't here and is, getting on with a lot of his commercial work. This raises a very, very big question for me and, for you and for Con Home. Who is going to run the general election campaign if there's one in the autumn? The party's got used to outsourcing its campaigns, the management of them, and outsourcing them to one L. Crosby, as it did in 2017, 2015, and 2005, very successfully in 2015. Now, if for whatever reason Linton Crosby is not there to have complete authority over any campaign in the autumn, I'm asking myself, who is going to run this campaign?
Indeed, part of that, of course, Mark Fulbrook's specialism in terms of actual kind of machine campaigning, grassroots or organisation, actually going out persuading people. We've discussed that in previous episodes of this podcast, how that's been targeted very effectively at the electorate in this round, which is the membership of the Conservative Party. Part of the question, I think, will be influenced by the state of play of the politics around the government. So going back to that question of what happens with some of the former ministers who become rebels, how embattled and how early on will Downing Street under Boris Johnson become embattled? Because that will influence what kind of party chairman you have. It depends what kind of person you choose for the job. It depends what they're actually able to do. How much bandwidth do they have to do the undoubtedly necessary reforms in CCHQ and restructuring of the party? How much time do they have to go around the country firing up the troops and making sure that the data and the tech people and all that kind of stuff is in place as well? Or how much time is a party chairman going to have to spend on Newsnight defending Downing Street, working as somebody to prop up the Prime Minister?
My reading of it is the new chairman may only have the best part of a month, and that month is August, to get the party into condition for an election. Just if you had to choose, who would you have as party chairman, Mark? And who do you think it should be, in any event, two different but related questions?
Well, the first thing to note is that what we're all assuming is that it won't be the current party chairman, Brandon Lewis. And I think that's likely, but in some ways it's probably a little bit harsh on him that is likely now, because as I say, I think this race overall has been organised pretty well, and actually I think with the state of Downing Street over the last couple of years, it's been pretty difficult for a party chairman to do more than he's done in terms of some of the reforms of party membership and that kind of thing. But it does seem like it seems extremely likely that a new Prime Minister will choose this as kind of role to dish out. A few names that you hear circling around this. James Cleverly is kind of mentioned in relation to it, but he's Brandon Lewis's deputy and friend, and I think it would be perhaps slightly difficult for him to directly take on the role. I've heard several people this week suggest that Team Boris are thinking about Priti Patel in relation to this job. If that's the case, then you're talking about kind of dual function, one being a kind of proper street fighting campaigner, the other being an absolute kind of Brexit attack dog, somebody who would I suspect be on the airwaves a lot. The other question is whether you find somebody who is going to be kind of more plugged into the campaigning structure of the party. And actually, it's quite striking. There aren't a lot of Conservative MPs who are in the running to sit around the cabinet table who also really display a huge amount of interest, never mind insight, into how you actually structure a modern campaign. Whoever it is, I think they'll really have to make sure they can outsource a lot of the direct restructuring and organisational work to a very clearly empowered and authoritative chief executive.
Once upon a time, it's not that long ago, before this leadership election, I toyed with the idea of having Jeremy Hunt as party chairman because, just in case no one knows, he's a businessman, an entrepreneur with an experience of running things. I'm not being sarky, I'm being quite serious. I thought that if you wanted someone who understood how to organise something, and went into a difficult job as health secretary and came out the other end with the service having experienced huge upheaval under Andrew Lansley, and who then settled it down, I thought Jeremy Hunt would be quite a nice idea. I don't see that happening for a moment. So instead, you're looking at Cleverly, possibly Priti Patel, really could be one of any number of people, depending upon what Boris Johnson wants to do with it. Like you, I think he'll move Brandon Lewis just because getting a new chairman is the kind of thing that new leaders do, whether or not that's fair or unfair. And that kind of takes me to the bigger, and perhaps our final subject of the cabinet, because it was your mention of Priti Patel that got me thinking. I think at the moment there are 3 women fully entitled, full members of Theresa May's cabinet, other than her. That's Karen Bradley and Penny Mordaunt and Amber Rudd. And then there are a number who are entitled to attend. I think Boris Johnson will be very sensitive to the charge that this is a boys' club, and he will be kind of expected to boost the number of women. And the way things work is that he'll also want to boost the number of ethnic minority members in the cabinet. And in Priti Patel, you've got someone who's a member of an ethnic minority, is a woman, and is a very strong Brexiteer. So I expect to see her in. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if she got a very big job. I mean, other than that, I'm really finding it very difficult to say who is going to end up in what spot where, and fall back on the thought that you'll see more women, more ethnic minority members. He's going to have a number of solid Brexiteers to support him. He will, I think, want to come to some sort of accommodation with Jeremy Hunt. Other than that, I feel that he could do almost anything with these appointments.
More women, more ethnic minorities, more Gavin Williamson. I think it seems pretty clear that having played quite an important role in effectively a whipping operation targeting the parliamentary party, alongside some others like James Wharton, the former MP who advised the team at that stage, particularly. Clearly Gavin Williamson's in the running for some kind of return. What happens to Esther McVey, for example, in this process? it's quite interesting to consider the role of Karen Bradley, I think, where you have somebody who clearly benefits from the fact that she's got ministerial experience and she's a female minister in a party that still doesn't have, it still isn't replete with female MPs in the running for cabinet roles. But the Northern Ireland, position of Northern Ireland Secretary is increasingly sensitive because of the discussion of Brexit and the backstop and because of the reliance on the DUP for the majority. And Karen Bradley has had quite a difficult time in the role. So there you've got a dilemma. Are you working on the overall cabinet split, or are you going to work on the individual role?
There's also what you could call the greybeard question, which is related to the bringing back question, which you raised right at the start of what you just said by mentioning Gavin Williamson. There must be a limited number of people you can bring back. He's going to bring back, we think, Priti Patel. He's presumably going to bring back Gavin Williamson. So the whole question about whether or not he could also bring back Michael Fallon if he wanted to, or even bring back and bring in IDS, which is another idea that's being floated around. And the only thing I'll say about this is he can't bring back all of them. And he's going to have to be sort of quite economical about the number of people who he does, in quotes, bring back, unquote, because there are a number of people waiting to come up. So he can't simply fill the cabinet with people who've been in it before.
Yes, there's that whole question of the new generation, including various names, of course, who were spoken of before the leadership race as possible contenders, people who might have taken a gamble and thrown their hat in the ring and given it a go, but who didn't, several of whom were quite strong, have been quite strong supporters of Boris Johnson, who it wouldn't necessarily be a complete surprise to see step up.
No, and there we are. We look ahead to next week, and we've got the decision. We've got the whole sort of spectre of these ministers resigning. We'll presumably have the cabinet appointments by the end of next week. We expect to see Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. We expect there not to be a no confidence vote, but we don't really know. At any rate, the podcast will be back next week, and let's just look forward and see what this week will bring.